$1,000 to anyone who can take a United States Marine down. Captain Ryan Cole's voice rolled across the training field with the confidence of a man who had never questioned the certainty of his own world. Laughter, applause, and playful cheers answered him beneath the bright Carolina sun as families, veterans, recruits, and active-duty Marines gathered around the demonstration mat set up for the annual base open house. Children waved miniature American flags while food trucks filled the warm afternoon air with the scent of barbecue and fresh lemonade. A large digital scoreboard flashed the words "Friendly Challenge," and a handwritten sign beside it promised the same prize Ryan had just announced. $1,000. Cash. Beat a Marine. Take it home. The offer had become the day's biggest attraction, but after nearly an hour of volunteers stepping forward, every challenger had walked away smiling, shaking hands, and admitting defeat with good humor. Ryan folded his arms across his athletic frame, wearing the relaxed grin of someone who knew the contest would remain unbeatable. His Marines represented discipline, confidence, and countless hours of training. The crowd believed exactly what he believed. Nobody was taking that money. Then the murmuring near the back of the spectators slowly faded. An elderly man was making his way toward the demonstration area with measured, unhurried steps. His weathered oak cane tapped softly against the concrete every few seconds, creating a rhythm that somehow carried farther than the surrounding conversations. He wore faded blue jeans, polished brown work boots that had clearly been cared for over many years, and an old olive field jacket whose color had surrendered long ago to countless summers and winters. His white hair rested neatly beneath a plain tan cap with no insignia, no medals, no military patches, nothing that invited attention. He looked like the kind of grandfather who preferred quiet mornings on a front porch to crowded military events. Ryan noticed him immediately and smiled with polite amusement. "Sir," he called, loud enough for the audience to hear. "The seating area is over there if you'd rather watch." A ripple of chuckles passed through the crowd. The old man stopped only a few feet from the edge of the mat. His pale blue eyes calmly surveyed the Marines standing nearby. He nodded once, as though appreciating their posture more than their muscles. "I heard the announcement," he replied in a low, gravelly voice. "Does the offer still stand?" More laughter erupted. One Marine covered his grin, while another whispered something that caused his friends to shake with silent amusement. Ryan walked closer, keeping his expression friendly but unmistakably patronizing. "It does, sir. But this isn't exactly a senior fitness class." Even louder laughter followed. The old man neither smiled nor frowned. His face remained still, almost peaceful, as though the joke had floated past him without ever finding a place to land. He rested both hands lightly on the top of his cane and glanced toward the handwritten prize sign. $1,000, he repeated quietly. "If someone can take a Marine down." Ryan nodded confidently. "That's right." The old man lifted his eyes back to the captain. "And if I win," he asked with perfect sincerity, "you'll still pay an old man?" Captain Ryan Cole studied the old man for another long moment before letting out a patient sigh that carried just enough confidence to entertain the growing crowd. He had spent more than a decade in uniform, had led physical training courses, obstacle competitions, and countless public demonstrations, and he had developed an instinct for reading people within seconds. Everything about the elderly visitor suggested an ordinary retiree who had wandered into the excitement looking for a memorable story to tell his neighbors. There was no tension in the man's shoulders, no aggressive posture, no attempt to impress anyone. Even the weathered oak cane appeared less like an accessory and more like an honest necessity earned through decades of life. Ryan glanced toward the Marines standing behind him. They exchanged knowing smiles, careful not to laugh too loudly out of respect for the visitors, but their expressions revealed the same conclusion. This would end with a polite handshake and a photograph. Nothing more. "Of course we would pay you," Ryan answered with a grin. "The rules do not change because of age." The old man gave a slow nod, as though satisfied by the answer itself rather than the money attached to it. "Fair enough," he said quietly. Around them, more spectators drifted toward the demonstration area, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Parents lifted young children onto their shoulders for a better view, while several teenagers quietly raised their phones to record whatever happened next. Staff Sergeant Lucas Bennett watched from the far side of the training lane, his arms folded across his chest. Unlike the others, he was not smiling. Years of experience had taught him that appearances often hid stories no uniform could reveal. He noticed the old man's eyes first. They did not wander around the crowd searching for attention. Instead, they calmly observed distances, footing, shadows, and people with the quiet awareness of someone who had spent a lifetime noticing details other people ignored. Ryan stepped closer with the relaxed confidence expected of an instructor. "Sir, before we continue, may I ask your name?" "Ethan Walker." "First time visiting the base, Mr. Walker?" Ethan looked across the training grounds where young Marines were helping children climb into display vehicles while a military band rehearsed somewhere beyond the nearby buildings. A gentle breeze carried the distant sound of brass instruments across the parade field. "No," he answered after a brief pause. "It has been a long time, but this place feels familiar." Ryan assumed he meant he had once attended an air show or a community event. "Well, we are glad to have you here today." Ethan smiled faintly, almost too subtly for anyone to notice. "Thank you, Captain." Ryan blinked for the briefest instant. He had never introduced himself by rank. His name tape was partially hidden beneath the microphone clipped across his chest, and he had been standing nearly 20 feet away when Ethan first approached. Ryan dismissed the thought as luck. After all, anyone could recognize an officer by the insignia on his collar if they looked carefully enough. Still, something about the effortless way Ethan had spoken lingered quietly in the back of his mind. Lucas noticed it too. His eyes shifted from Ryan's collar to the old man's calm expression. Ethan rested both hands lightly upon the smooth handle of his cane, standing with remarkable balance despite his age. He did not appear impatient. He did not appear nervous. Most surprising of all, he did not seem interested in proving anything. It was as though the challenge itself mattered far less than the people accepting it. The cheerful atmosphere remained, but beneath the laughter another feeling had begun to emerge, subtle enough that few recognized it. Curiosity had quietly replaced amusement, and without anyone realizing exactly why, the afternoon no longer felt like an ordinary public demonstration. Captain Ryan Cole slowly nodded, then turned toward the spectators with the polished confidence of someone who had spent years commanding both Marines and audiences. "All right," he announced, spreading his hands with an easy smile. "Looks like Mr. Walker wants to see whether experience can compete with youth." A wave of laughter swept across the viewing area. Several Marines exchanged playful comments while a few visitors applauded simply because the unexpected challenge had become the most entertaining moment of the afternoon. Ethan Walker remained exactly where he stood. His weathered hands rested lightly on the smooth handle of his cane, and his expression never changed. He watched the laughter come and go the same way he watched the breeze move across the parade field. It existed, then it passed. Ryan motioned toward a broad-shouldered corporal standing near the front of the formation. "Corporal Mason Brooks," he said proudly. "State wrestling champion before he joined the Corps. One of the strongest Marines in the battalion." Brooks stepped forward with a friendly grin and folded his arms. "Sir, are we really doing this?" Ryan laughed. "Only if Mr. Walker still wants to." Every eye turned toward Ethan. He looked at the young corporal for several quiet seconds before speaking. "He looks like a good young man." Brooks smiled politely. "Thank you, sir." Ethan inclined his head. "I would rather not embarrass him." The words landed gently, almost kindly, yet they produced another round of laughter from the crowd. Someone near the food trucks whistled while another spectator jokingly shouted that the old man had confidence. Ryan shook his head, amused more than offended. "I appreciate the spirit, Mr. Walker, but Corporal Brooks has spent years preparing for challenges exactly like this." Ethan answered without changing his tone. "I do not doubt that for a second." Lucas Bennett continued watching from across the demonstration area. The old veteran had not insulted anyone. He had not bragged. Every sentence sounded respectful, yet each carried an odd certainty that refused to disappear. Lucas had heard that kind of confidence only a handful of times in his career. It never belonged to people trying to prove themselves. It belonged to people who no longer needed to. Ryan stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. "Before we begin," he said, "I should make one thing clear. This demonstration is friendly. Safety comes first." Ethan nodded immediately. "I would expect nothing less from Marines." Ryan smiled. "Good. Then we understand each other." Ethan glanced toward the line of young Marines waiting nearby. Their uniforms were perfectly pressed despite the afternoon heat. Their boots reflected the sunlight. Their posture reminded him of generations that had stood exactly the same way long before these young men had been born. His eyes lingered on them with quiet admiration rather than judgment. Finally, he looked back at Ryan. "May I ask one question?" "Of course." "Will there only be one volunteer?" Ryan raised an eyebrow. "One should be enough." Ethan considered the answer before slowly shaking his head. "No, Captain. That is not what I meant." Ryan folded his arms again, curious now. "Then what did you mean?" Ethan's pale blue eyes remained calm as ever. "I was wondering whether everyone who wishes to participate should come at once, or whether you prefer they take turns." The laughter stopped almost instantly. No one spoke. Even the children who had been running along the edge of the field slowed to a halt. Ryan searched Ethan's face for any trace of sarcasm, but found none. The old man had asked the question with complete sincerity, as though he genuinely believed it was the most practical detail left to settle before the demonstration could begin. Captain Ryan Cole held the old cane for another moment before handing it back, with an easy smile that kept the atmosphere light. "Well," he said, "whatever this old piece of wood has been through, it certainly lasted longer than most equipment we issue today." A ripple of laughter moved through the spectators again. Ethan Walker accepted the cane with both hands, his fingers naturally finding the polished curve of the handle. He gently brushed his thumb across a shallow scar carved into the oak, so small that nobody except him seemed to notice it. His eyes lingered there in complete silence. The cheerful voices surrounding the demonstration field slowly faded inside his mind until all he could hear was the distant whisper of rain falling through dense jungle leaves. The warm Carolina sunshine disappeared behind a memory that had never truly left him. More than 60 years earlier, the air had been thick with humidity, carrying the scent of wet earth, diesel fuel, and fresh-cut bamboo. Young Sergeant Ethan Walker stood among a handful of exhausted reconnaissance Marines deep inside a remote training area far from any parade field or cheering crowd. Every uniform was stained with mud. Every face carried the quiet determination that only long days without comfort could produce. Standing before them was Master Sergeant Daniel Mercer, a man whose calm voice never needed to rise above ordinary conversation to command complete attention. In his weathered hands rested a hardwood staff nearly identical to the cane Ethan carried today. The older instructor slowly walked across the clearing while the students watched every movement. He never demonstrated strength. He demonstrated balance. He never rushed a step. He simply seemed to arrive exactly where he needed to be before anyone expected him to move. "Most people think control comes from force," Mercer had said, drawing a straight line through the damp soil with the end of the wooden staff. "That is the first mistake they make." The young Marines listened without speaking. "If your only answer is strength," Mercer continued, "you will eventually meet someone stronger. If your answer is timing, patience, and understanding another person's movement, age will matter much less than people believe." Ethan remembered watching the old instructor lift the staff no higher than his waist before gently redirecting the momentum of a much younger Marine during a simple training exercise. There was no anger, no dramatic display, no struggle, just quiet precision that left every student staring in respectful disbelief. After the exercise, Mercer handed Ethan the staff. "Carry it," he had said. "Not because you need it today. Carry it until you understand why one day you might." Years later, after countless assignments, retirements, reunions, and ordinary mornings that blended into peaceful afternoons, the training staff had eventually become a walking cane. Time had smoothed its surface. Weather had darkened the grain. The shallow dent near the handle had come from years of honest use, but the lesson inside it had never faded. The memory dissolved as gently as it had arrived. Ethan found himself standing once again beneath the clear afternoon sky, while families chatted nearby and children pointed excitedly toward the Marines waiting on the demonstration mat. Captain Ryan Cole mistook the veteran's silence for sentimentality. "It must carry a lot of memories," he said politely. Ethan looked down at the polished oak before lifting his calm blue eyes toward the young officer. "More lessons than memories," he answered softly. Ryan smiled without fully understanding. "Then perhaps it has brought you good luck." Ethan's expression remained peaceful. "Luck has very little to do with it, Captain. Staff Sergeant Lucas Bennett stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, studying both the cane and the old Marine who held it. Something about that simple answer settled heavily in his thoughts. It was not the confidence of someone hoping to surprise a crowd. It sounded like the quiet certainty of a man repeating a truth he had spent an entire lifetime proving to himself. The smile never left Captain Ryan Cole's face, but it had become noticeably smaller. Around him, the cheerful energy of the demonstration continued as families drifted between exhibits and the Marine Corps band rehearsed another patriotic march somewhere beyond the parade field. Yet inside the circle surrounding Ethan Walker, the mood had quietly changed. Nobody had seen a demonstration. Nobody had witnessed extraordinary skill. Still, the old man's calm certainty refused to disappear. Ryan motioned toward Corporal Mason Brooks once more. "All right, gentlemen," he said with practiced confidence. "Let us give our guest a proper welcome." Brooks stepped onto the training mat and offered Ethan a respectful nod. "Whenever you are ready, sir." Ethan did not move. Instead, he looked carefully at the young Marine's polished boots, relaxed shoulders, and steady breathing. His eyes reflected admiration rather than evaluation. "You remind me of someone," he said softly. Brooks smiled. "Hopefully someone who did well." Ethan answered with a faint smile of his own. "Someone who listened." The words carried him backward once again. The years melted away until the sounds of children and brass instruments disappeared beneath the steady rhythm of rainfall striking broad jungle leaves. Sergeant Ethan Walker stood beneath a camouflage tarp beside Master Sergeant Daniel Mercer as another group of young reconnaissance Marines completed a demanding exercise. Every one of them was physically gifted. Every one of them believed determination alone could solve every problem placed before them. Mercer quietly watched them recover before speaking. "Strength is easy to admire because everyone can see it," he said. "Judgment is different. Judgment hides until the exact moment it becomes necessary." One young Marine raised his hand. "Master Sergeant, what if the other man is faster?" Mercer smiled gently. "Then allow him to arrive first." Another recruit looked puzzled. "What if he is stronger?" Mercer rested both hands on the hardwood staff. "Then let him carry the burden of his own strength." Confused expressions spread across the students. Mercer slowly walked toward Ethan. "Walker." "Yes, Master Sergeant." "Come here." Ethan stepped forward. Mercer handed him the wooden staff. "Show them how little movement is actually required." Ethan hesitated. "Sir, they have not finished the lesson." Mercer nodded approvingly. "Exactly. They are still looking at the staff instead of the person holding it." The students laughed quietly, believing another lecture was coming. Instead, Mercer continued speaking with remarkable patience. "People see uniforms. They see muscles. They see equipment. They almost never notice posture, breathing, attention, or intent. The greatest advantage you will ever have is another person's certainty that he already understands you." Ethan remembered that sentence more clearly than any field manual he had ever studied. It followed him through every assignment, every classroom, every quiet conversation with younger Marines after his own years as an instructor began. Long after retirement, neighbors assumed the cane supported weak legs. Cashiers hurried to open doors because they saw only age. Children smiled politely because they saw a grandfather enjoying an afternoon walk. Ethan never corrected any of them. There was peace in allowing people to believe whatever they wished. The memory gradually dissolved beneath the warm Carolina sunlight once again. Ethan looked across the demonstration mat, where Corporal Brooks waited patiently, without arrogance or impatience. The young Marine had remained perfectly respectful throughout the entire exchange. Ethan appreciated that more than anyone realized. Captain Ryan glanced at his watch before addressing the spectators. "We have kept everyone waiting long enough." Applause rose from the crowd. Phones lifted into the air. Staff Sergeant Lucas Bennett watched Ethan tighten his fingers around the smooth oak cane for just a moment before relaxing them again. It was not the grip of a nervous man preparing for a contest. It looked remarkably similar to someone greeting an old friend before beginning a conversation that had started many decades earlier. Captain Ryan Cole stepped backward and raised one hand toward the crowd. The conversations gradually faded until only the distant flutter of American flags and the low hum of aircraft crossing the afternoon sky remained. "Friendly demonstration," Ryan reminded everyone with an easy smile. Nothing more. Corporal Mason Brooks acknowledged the instruction with a respectful nod before turning his full attention toward Ethan Walker. The young Marine stood balanced, disciplined, and completely confident without appearing disrespectful. Ethan appreciated that. He slowly stepped onto the center of the training mat, the polished oak cane touching the ground with a soft, familiar tap. Every movement seemed unhurried. Every breath seemed measured. Children leaned forward from behind the safety line, while parents quietly lowered their conversations. Even those who had been laughing only moments earlier now watched with genuine curiosity. Ryan gestured toward Brooks. "Whenever both of you are ready." Brooks smiled politely. "I will follow your lead, sir." Ethan returned the smile. "That is the first good decision anyone has made today." A few quiet laughs rippled through the audience, but this time they carried more warmth than mockery. Ethan lifted the cane from the ground and held it lightly across both hands. It was never raised in a threatening manner. Instead, it rested there almost like a pointer in the hands of an old teacher preparing to explain a lesson. "Before we begin," Ethan said, looking directly at Brooks, "tell me what you see." The young Marine seemed surprised by the question. "An older gentleman with a cane." Ethan nodded. "Good. Now look again." Brooks studied him more carefully. The faded jacket, the worn boots, the steady eyes, the relaxed shoulders. Nothing changed. "I still see the same man." Ethan smiled gently. "Exactly." He lowered the cane until its tip lightly touched the edge of the mat. "Most people stop looking once they believe they have found the answer." The words settled over the crowd. Staff Sergeant Lucas Bennett felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He had heard instructors speak about observation countless times during his career, but something about the old veteran's calm delivery sounded strangely familiar, as though the lesson had been repeated through generations without anyone remembering where it had begun. Ryan folded his arms, patiently waiting for the demonstration to move forward, yet he found himself listening as closely as everyone else. Ethan took one slow step to his left. Brooks naturally adjusted his own footing to remain squared in front of him. Ethan nodded almost imperceptibly. "Thank you," he said. Brooks looked confused. "For what, sir?" "For showing everyone exactly what I hoped they would notice." Murmurs spread through the spectators. Ryan glanced toward Lucas, who was now watching with narrowed eyes instead of casual interest. Ethan continued in the same calm voice. "You moved because you believed I wanted you to move. You never questioned why." Brooks looked down at his own boots for a brief second before realizing he had shifted position without conscious thought. Ethan had never touched him. He had never issued a command. He had simply taken a single quiet step. Ethan rested both hands on the handle of the cane once again. "Real leadership is often like that," he said. "The smallest movement can shape every movement that follows." The training field had become remarkably silent. The spectators no longer waited for excitement. They waited for understanding. Captain Ryan Cole slowly uncrossed his arms, his confident smile fading into thoughtful concentration. For the first time that afternoon, he was no longer watching an elderly visitor participating in a friendly challenge. He was watching a man who seemed capable of turning the simplest moment into a lesson that every Marine standing on that field instinctively wanted to remember. Staff Sergeant Lucas Bennett could no longer ignore the growing feeling in the back of his mind. He had spent nearly 18 years in the Marine Corps, serving under instructors whose names carried quiet respect throughout the service. Yet something about Ethan Walker's movements reached much farther back than any course Lucas had attended. It was not simply the way the elderly veteran stood. It was the remarkable economy of every motion. Ethan never wasted a step. He never shifted his weight without purpose. Even the brief pause before each sentence seemed intentional, giving everyone around him just enough time to think before speaking again. Lucas had seen that rhythm before, but never in person. He simply could not remember where. Captain Ryan Cole glanced toward him with a questioning expression. Lucas answered with only the slightest shake of his head. He did not have an explanation yet. Ethan remained facing Corporal Mason Brooks, who now looked less like a competitor and more like an attentive student. The young Marine's shoulders had relaxed. His breathing had slowed. Without realizing it, he had begun mirroring Ethan's calm posture instead of preparing for a contest. Lucas noticed it immediately. So did Ryan. Neither man said a word. Ethan looked kindly at Brooks. "You listen well," he said. "Never lose that." Brooks nodded respectfully. "Thank you, sir." Ethan smiled. That habit will carry you farther than strength ever will. Lucas felt another spark of recognition. The phrasing was familiar. Not the exact words, but the philosophy behind them. He had heard nearly the same lesson quoted years earlier by an aging drill instructor who insisted the principle came from one of the forgotten architects of modern reconnaissance training. At the time, Lucas had assumed it was another piece of Marine Corps folklore, one of those stories passed from instructor to instructor until nobody remembered its origin. Now he was no longer certain. He quietly stepped away from the spectators and reached into his pocket for his phone. The signal was weak but usable. Instead of calling anyone in his own chain of command, he searched an internal contact list until he found someone he had not spoken with in almost 3 years. Sergeant Major Richard Collins had retired only months earlier after serving at Headquarters Marine Corps. If anyone still remembered old names hidden inside forgotten training manuals, it would be him. The phone rang twice. Collins speaking. Sergeant Major, this is Lucas Bennett. Lucas, it has been a while. Everything all right? Lucas lowered his voice and turned away from the crowd. I hope so, Sergeant Major. I need to ask you something unusual. Go ahead. Lucas glanced back toward Ethan, who continued speaking quietly with Corporal Brooks while the spectators listened in complete silence. Have you ever heard of an instructor named Ethan Walker? There was no answer for several seconds. Lucas wondered whether the call had disconnected. Finally, Collins spoke again, but his voice had completely changed. Where did you hear that name? He is standing in front of me. Another long silence followed. Lucas could hear nothing except slow breathing on the other end of the line. When Collins finally answered, his words came carefully. Describe him. Mid-80s. White hair. Worn olive jacket. Oak cane. Calm blue eyes. Collins exhaled slowly. Lucas, does that cane have a polished handle with a small dent near the top? Lucas looked immediately toward Ethan. Even from 30 feet away, he could clearly see the shallow mark in the dark oak where years of use had smoothed the wood. Yes, he answered quietly. It does. Collins did not respond right away. When he finally spoke, the respect in his voice was unmistakable. Do not let him leave. I am making one call, and if I am right, your base commander is about to learn that the man standing on your training field helped write lessons Marines are still being taught today. Staff Sergeant Lucas Bennett slipped his phone back into his pocket, but the weight of Sergeant Major Collins's final words refused to leave his thoughts. He looked across the demonstration mat, where Ethan Walker continued speaking with Corporal Mason Brooks, as though nothing unusual had happened. The old veteran's calm expression had not changed. He stood beneath the warm afternoon sun with one hand resting lightly upon the polished oak cane, while families watched in complete silence. Captain Ryan Cole noticed Lucas returning and quietly stepped beside him. Everything all right? He asked. Lucas hesitated. I am not sure yet. Ryan studied his face. That does not sound reassuring. Before Lucas could answer, a sharp voice echoed across the parade field. Captain Cole. Everyone turned. A military utility vehicle had stopped near the edge of the demonstration area. 2 aides stepped out first, followed immediately by Major General Thomas Harrington. The conversations throughout the open house faded almost instantly. Marines standing near the exhibits instinctively straightened their posture, while visitors quietly stepped aside to clear a path. Ryan looked genuinely surprised. The general had been scheduled to greet community leaders at another event nearly half a mile away. There was no reason for him to appear here without notice. Ryan quickly walked forward and rendered a crisp salute. Sir, welcome. We were just finishing a demonstration. Major General Harrington acknowledged the greeting without taking his eyes off the elderly man standing calmly beside the training mat. Captain, he said quietly, which one is Mr. Ethan Walker? Ryan pointed politely toward the old veteran. Right there, sir. The general did not answer. Instead, he began walking directly toward Ethan with measured, purposeful steps. The crowd naturally parted before him. Families whispered among themselves while the Marines exchanged uncertain glances. Lucas watched the general's expression change with every step. Surprise became recognition. Recognition became unmistakable respect. Ethan heard the approaching footsteps and slowly turned. For a brief moment, the two men simply looked at one another across a few feet of sunlit concrete. Neither spoke. Captain Ryan waited for an introduction or an explanation, but neither came. Then, without hesitation, Major General Thomas Harrington stopped directly in front of Ethan Walker and came to the position of attention. Every Marine on the field instinctively froze. The general raised his right hand in a flawless salute. The movement was crisp, deliberate, and carried none of the ceremony reserved for public appearances. It was personal. It was genuine. Ethan looked at the general for a quiet moment before returning the salute with calm dignity. Not a single sound came from the crowd. Even the children seemed to understand that something important was unfolding. After lowering his hand, the general smiled with unmistakable warmth. "Sir," he said, "I have waited many years to thank you in person." Ethan's expression softened. "That is kind of you, General. But there is no need." Harrington gently shook his head. "There has always been a need. Every reconnaissance instructor who taught me spoke your name with respect, even when they believed no one else remembered it." Captain Ryan slowly looked toward Lucas, searching for answers that neither of them possessed. The general finally turned to face the assembled Marines. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced in a steady voice, "the man standing before you did far more than serve our corps. Much of what young Marines still learn about observation, movement, patience, and leadership began with lessons he helped develop decades ago. His name faded from public memory, but his work never disappeared." A wave of astonishment spread through the gathering. Ryan looked back at Ethan Walker, no longer seeing a quiet retiree with an old cane. For the first time that afternoon, he understood why the elderly veteran had never felt the need to prove anything at all. For several long seconds, no one moved. The afternoon breeze carried the sound of distant flags snapping above the parade ground, but inside the demonstration area the silence was complete. Captain Ryan Cole slowly lowered his eyes, replaying every word he had spoken since Ethan Walker first approached the training mat. None of his remarks had been cruel, yet he suddenly realized how quickly confidence could become assumption. He stepped forward until he stood directly before the elderly veteran. "Sir," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Ethan looked at him with the same calm expression he had worn all afternoon. "For what, Captain?" Ryan hesitated before answering. "For believing I already knew who you were before I ever took the time to learn your name." Ethan smiled gently. "That is an easy mistake to make. We all do it sometimes." Ryan nodded with sincere humility. "I hope I do not make it again." Major General Thomas Harrington watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. "Captain Cole," he said, "the greatest instructors are not the ones who never make mistakes. They are the ones willing to learn in front of others." Ryan accepted the words with a respectful nod. Nearby, Corporal Mason Brooks stepped forward carrying the white envelope that held the prize money. He stopped in front of Ethan and offered it with both hands. "Sir," he said, "you earned this the moment you stepped onto the mat." Ethan accepted the envelope politely but did not open it. Instead, he looked toward a booth near the entrance where volunteers from the Marine Corps Relief Society had spent the afternoon collecting donations for families facing unexpected hardships. He slowly walked across the concrete, his oak cane tapping softly with each measured step. The crowd followed at a respectful distance. Reaching the donation table, Ethan placed the unopened envelope into the collection box. The volunteer looked up in surprise. "Sir, are you certain?" Ethan smiled. "There are young Marines with families who will put it to better use than I ever could." The volunteer thanked him quietly, unable to find any other words. When Ethan turned back toward the training field, something remarkable happened without anyone giving a command. Corporal Brooks came to attention first. Then Captain Ryan Cole did the same. One by one, every Marine standing nearby instinctively followed. Staff Sergeant Lucas Bennett never issued an order. Major General Harrington never raised his voice. Respect spread through the formation on its own until dozens of Marines stood silently at attention beneath the bright Carolina sky. Families who had arrived expecting an afternoon of entertainment found themselves witnessing something entirely different. Parents gently placed their hands on their children's shoulders. Conversations stopped. Phones slowly lowered. The moment no longer belonged on a screen. Ethan paused before leaving the demonstration area and looked back one final time. His eyes rested briefly on the young Marines standing so straight beneath the afternoon sun. "Take care of each other," he said softly. "The uniform changes. The mission changes. The equipment changes. Character is the one thing you carry home." No one answered because no answer was necessary. Ethan adjusted his weathered jacket, rested one hand upon the polished oak cane, and quietly walked toward the parking lot. His pace never changed. He disappeared beyond the row of American flags exactly as he had arrived, without ceremony and without asking anyone to remember his name. Yet long after he had gone, the lesson remained. Captain Ryan Cole would later tell every new Marine he instructed that the most important person in the room was often the one seeking no attention at all. Staff Sergeant Lucas Bennett saved the old instructor's name inside his notebook, determined that future generations would know where those timeless lessons had truly begun. And on that warm afternoon, every person who stood on that training field discovered that real greatness rarely announces itself. It simply arrives with quiet confidence, leaves with quiet dignity, and changes everyone who was willing enough to pay attention. Some warriors never ask to be recognized. They simply spend a lifetime giving others something worth remembering.